Now, since you woke up early and came to class, I figured I should actually tell you something about evolution. So we're going to dispense with all the administrative stuff now and get back to sex. Yeah, what a transition, right? We're still working on this first part. So when we come to class next week, we'll start talking about why sex evolves, or why asexual reproduction evolves. So the costs and benefits, 16.2 and 16.3 in the textbook, we'll get on Monday. I wanted to spend a little bit more time touching on basically results from last class. A lot of you said in the end of class Socratic quiz that one of the things that you thought was most interesting about the class was learning about parthenogenesis and how it works. So I thought it would be a useful time to have a brief aside and talk about some things that are related to parthenogenesis. That is, things that go wrong or that go differently during fertilization and immediately after fertilization in embryonic development. And that has everything to do with human or non-human chimeras. The idea that you can have, in mythology, two organisms that are fused together, like a lion and a dragon, for example. Although in this case, we're not talking about lions and dragons. Today we're going to talk about some other species. And the way this works is that two organisms, during development, basically fuse together into one. And this happens in humans and tigers, as we'll see, and you probably have already seen if you've been flipping through the slides. And this is basically, in humans and in other species, what happens when you have a twinning event, but one of the twins doesn't survive. Or they do survive, but they survive together as one individual. So hopefully everybody's comfortable with the idea that at fertilization you have one cell. And that after that, what happens during development? What's the next step?
The size of the cell remains the same, but the number of cells increases drastically.
Right, so you get cell division, then you become a 2-cell embryo, and then you become a 4-cell embryo after another set of divisions, and then 8, 16, 32 cells, etc. And at some point during early development, those divisions start becoming asynchronous. That is, you no longer have an exact multiple of 2 cells. You start getting odd numbers of cells as you grow as a fetus. So with this background in developmental biology, which is not much of a background in developmental biology, how did human twins form? What are the two ways that we get twins?
I think that one is that there's 2 eggs.
Okay. So you've got 2 oocytes and you've got 2 sperm. So you have 2 independent fertilization events, right? So are those twins fraternal, what we colloquially call fraternal twins? And we call them fraternal twins because they're no more genetically similar to each other than brothers. There's like mom carried one embryo to term and then another embryo to term with the same father. So you have 2 siblings, they just happen to be developing in the uterus and born at the same time. The fraternal twin. What's the other?
Identical twin and zygote becomes 2.
Right, so identical, or what we sometimes call maternal twins. So how does that work? You have 1 cell, you have 2 cells, you have 4 cells. So really early in development, how does this lead to 2 different individuals? What happens? Somehow, and this is particularly unclear how, the single multicellular embryo splits in half, or divides, so that you get maybe 2 cells now in one part of the uterus, and another 2 cells from that 4-cell embryo nearby in the uterus. But for some mechanism that's unclear, one embryo physically divides into 2. So these 2 embryos then are genetically identical because they arose from cells that derived from the same single fertilization event. And then that one 2-cell embryo divides and becomes a 4-cell embryo, 4-cell embryo. Of course, there's a point in development after you get who knows, 1,000 cells, 2,000 cells, 4,000 cells, there's a point at which you can no longer have this process occur. So most identical twins form very early in development as a separation in half, or almost half maybe, of one embryo into two. Weird things that happen during development. What would happen, so normally, identical twins, those two embryos develop separately then, else it's discrete parts in the uterus, and then you have two separate, distinct individuals. How do Siamese twins form? Yeah, so either the two embryos don't go very far apart in the uterus, and so as they divide and divide and divide during early embryonic development, maybe they come together again as one physical individual, but develop separate sets of organs, limbs, heads, etc. So this is exactly the same idea as a chimera. So you can have two individuals, if they're developing inside the same uterus at the same time, could start out life as different individuals, and then during development fuse together into one organism. And this probably happens more frequently than we think. Some of the case studies I'm going to tell you about in just a minute highlight this, I think. Any questions about this? So this happens quite frequently. Fetus and fetu, which is like, it is chimerism. It's like Siamese twins, except one twin doesn't develop as much as the other. You can also have weird things like this, which was a mountain lion shot earlier this year in Idaho, from what, January 9th, 2016, I saved this. So it's a mountain lion with part of, it seems, another mountain lion growing out of its head. Some jaw at least, some teeth. So this is either a case of fetus and fetu, two individuals that were growing together, two siblings, have tissues that are fused into one body. Or it could be, as this article says, a different type of developmental event, which is a teratoma, which it says right here, which is a type of tumor that grows organs like it's starting to look like another individual. So weird things happen in development all the time, and would this be selected for or against, do you think? Would it impact the fitness of this individual? Ability to mate, ability to reproduce, ability to survive to reproduction?
I suppose it could depend how deep it is, like if it's going into its brain or something.
Right, so yeah, it's hard to tell from a picture whether this would necessarily impact fitness. I don't know how old this mountain lion is, so I don't know if it actually was an adult or not. Fully formed teeth and whiskers growing out the top of its head, though. That's pretty exciting. So this is where this idea of the Siamese twins came from, where the original twins from Siam, the bunker twins, a classic example of Siamese twin. Two genetically identical individuals, so there was one fertilization event, that embryo separated into two distinct embryos, and then sometime during development, those two embryos stuck together and finished completing development. Then you get these really cool and weird news stories. Man is his own twin. His uncle is the father of his son, or something like that. Right? So journalists have great fun, I'm sure, coming up with the leads and the headlines for these articles. So first line, U.S. man failed a paternity test after doctors revealed his dead twin is the genetic father of his child. You can't make this stuff up. It's like a movie. So the idea here, which it says down here in the third paragraph, so man has sex with a woman, they have a kid. At some point there's a paternity test, and the dad is only a partial match to his son, partial genetic match to his son. And so you take a saliva sample from the father to do the paternity test, he looks like he's genetically different from his son. But when you sample his sperm, the sperm of the man who claimed to be this kid's father, the sperm is a perfect match to the son. So in other words, as this says, the guy's cheek DNA, the DNA that's in his cheek cells is different than the DNA that's in his sperm. One individual, two different genomes. How does that happen? He's a chimera. So presumably, we don't know, but the story is, yeah, this man, the father of this child, had a twin growing at the same time inside the mom's uterus, and chimerism, those two individuals fused together, and this man happens to have his dead twin's tissues comprising his genitalia, basically. So at least his testes came from a separate individual, his dead twin, that he absorbed during development. And this doesn't just happen in guys. So here's the exact same thing. If you pay attention to these sorts of things, maybe it's because I check on Facebook, so once you click on one of these stories, then Facebook tells you should read all these other stories too. So maybe this is artificially enhancing how frequently this might happen, in my perspective. But this is a similar case. This mother was going through a divorce, so Lydia Fairchild, the mother, was going through a divorce, and so to get support from the state, she had to prove the maternity of the kids that she was asking support for. And she had a DNA test, and then she got in a bunch of legal trouble because the state basically sued her for, not insurance fraud, but whatever it is when it's fraud when you're claiming child support or support from the state, because the paternity and maternity test came back and said she wasn't the mother of her kids. And this is a fantastic quote. I wish I'd been the person that had been doing this interview and writing. So this lady's obstetrician who had delivered the kid was like, look, I've been an obstetrician long enough that I know when the woman's delivering a baby, and I was there, and this is definitely her baby, right? There's no doubt about it. And, yeah, I know this woman and she delivered this kid. So she's clearly the mom, but not according to DNA tests. And so this wound up being almost exactly the same story. This is the great headline, right? Pregnancy, no proof of motherhood. Woman was her own twin, and the twin was the mother of her children. So it's the same story. So her oocytes were being produced by tissues from a twin that had been absorbed by her during development. And so the eggs she was producing were not genetically identical to her somatic tissues. So then down here somewhere it says she had a pap smear, a cervical smear, and that tissue of hers was genetically identical to her kids. But the tissues that the state had been using before that to do the DNA testing, cheek swabs or blood samples, had the different set of DNA, her own somatic DNA, not her dead twin's DNA. The bottom paragraph is, I think, the most important thing, why I really wanted to bring up this topic today. Not so much because it's evolution related, but because it's important, I think, for us as a society to think about the impacts of evolution, development, and genetics on our legal system. People go to death row because of DNA tests. So we need to know how common is chimerism, and how many DNA tests, and for what different parts of an individual would you have to do to prove that somebody was or was not a person who committed a crime, whose DNA was collected at a crime scene. So we shouldn't be assuming that we are all individually have exactly the same DNA in all of our cells, because apparently, at least occasionally, that's not true. But is it true if it's parthenogenesis? In parthenogenesis, what does the genetic makeup of the kids look like compared to the one parent that they arise from?
I assume very similar.
So you'd think very similar. So it's if it's asexual reproduction, if it's one parent, not two, then you might predict that you'd have very similar genetic makeups of offspring when they're produced by virgin birth, parthenogenesis. The goal for today, aside from maybe having a little bit of perspective that we just had on potential societal relevance of genetics, evolution, and development, is to try to diagnose whether or not species are asexual or sexual. In the last class we talked about the definitions of asexuality versus sexuality. Here's a case study. I'm going to ask you whether or not these are, eventually, whether or not two species or two individuals are sexual or asexual. In California, we have these cool insects, chimera, and these are particularly interesting because some of these populations and species, the ones that are in boxes, are asexual. There are other species that you see around here, including in and around the Central Valley, are sexually reproducing, all the ones that don't have boxes around. So what's really particularly interesting to evolutionary biologists is the number of asexually reproducing species out there. And how long those species have been distinct species. So it seems like if you're one of these insects, you could be asexual and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with being an asexually reproducing species. So if you went out in the field and you saw this, would you think that that was a sexual, one of the sexual species of chimera or an asexually reproducing species of chimera? So I'm hearing a lot of sexual. So what are you seeing that makes you think that? What evidence do we have that that might be a sexually reproducing species? So the behavior or the positions. So is this a male mating with a female? If so, which one would the male be? Often the males are the smaller ones. Not true in every species, but it could be a male that's mating with a female on the bottom. What else could this be, though? It could be, right, it could be a big baby. Right, so this could be mom and a kid. So, hard to tell. Of course, you might also be using this evidence on the slide that says that this is a male and a female. Shame on you if you're cheating. No, it's not cheating.
Yeah.
So this does turn out to be a sexually reproducing species of this genus. The point is, aside from all the definitions that we came up with last time about asexual versus sexual reproduction, is it one parent or is it two? Is it gametes fusing versus mitotic tissue, that is paratomic fission, for example? You can also look at behaviors. So if two species are exhibiting behaviors that look like sexually reproducing species, they probably are a sexually reproducing species. So it's just one more piece of evidence that you can use to try to identify whether or not a species is asexual or sexual. The main point is, if you know this is a male and a female, let's say I told you that this was a male and a female and they were the same age. What does that tell us about this species?
Siblings?
So they could be siblings, they might not be siblings. So it's brother and sister mating with each other, that's fine. I'm not passing judgment on chimera, that's all I'm saying. They can do their own thing. No, but what does that tell us about this species? If these are male and female, they're the same age.
It
What?
could be sexually dimorphic, right?
So this could be an example of sexual dimorphism, right? Most species, you can tell the males and females apart somehow, by size or by coloration or by the presence of facial hair versus not, or something like that. So most species have some form of sexual dimorphism if they're a sexually reproducing species, right? by definition, if there are two sexes, then usually there's a way to distinguish the two sexes. And often we can do that with our eyes. Sometimes not. But that would be another piece of evidence that we could use to distinguish if a species is asexual or not. If everybody looks identical, and there's no differences, then it might be that there are no different sexes in the population of individuals you're looking at.
Dr. Ross, I have a funny question.
Please.
So if most females are larger than males, why is it that human species have larger males than females?
I'm glad you asked. I don't know the answer, but I'm glad you phrased it as a why question, because in science it's really hard to answer the why question. So you can ask me, how is it that human males are larger than females in our species? But it's unclear. So you're absolutely right. There is a trend that in a lot of species, females are larger than males, but not in all species. And we're just one example of that. And I'd have to look it up to see what sort of theories people have on why there is this reversal in some species. Breaks the trend. An excellent question that I will look into. Does anybody have thoughts about that? Anybody else know why?
It seems like there's particular clades where it's one way or another. Like I think mammals, don't they often tend to have larger males except in certain exceptions?
Right. So it could be that there's one evolutionary origin of males being bigger than females, and that's back in the mammalian, at the base of the mammalian tree, which would explain that. So we look for evolutionary patterns of those sorts of trends. But in fish, sometimes it's the other way, for example. So in fish, a lot of females are larger than the males. Then we can think about other things, which I'm not going to let myself get distracted by a tangent, but I could go off on a tangent, right, temporarily, about why would it be beneficial to think about this? That's all I'm going to say. Why would it be beneficial for a male to be larger or a female to be larger? So if the trait has evolved, it might be beneficial, an evolutionary biologist might suggest. So why larger sex? Why a larger female or why a larger male?
Dr. Ross?
Yeah.
Females tend to have more body fat than a male because of sexual reproduction, right? So.
Right, so part of it might be, adaptation to being the one that carries the children. It all comes down to sex. Okay. So for those of you that were done doing or had already done the course evaluation, I asked you to flip to this slide. Hopefully I had the right slide number on here. And to work on some predictions. So briefly, up here at the top I've diagrammed, this is stuff we talked about in genetics if you had genetics with me. The idea of different alleles of one gene, and they differ by how many repeats of this CA dinucleotide they have. So we can call the top allele CA7 because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 CAs in this gene. We call that the CA7 allele. And if you only have 1, 2, 3 CAs, you'd be the CA3 allele. So it's just different versions of genes. If you have an individual here that has one CA3 and one CA6, what does that tell us about their parents?
That one of them had a 3 and the other CA.
So at least, right, so I heard at least one of them has to have a CA3. Which one? Is it number 1 or number 2? Could be both, could be neither. Well, no, could be both or it could be one or the other. Can't be neither. Okay. So then one of the parents or both have to have a CA6. And the other parent could have some other random allele, CA7, for example. So this individual was produced by a combination of those two chromosomes. You get a CA3 and a CA6. Okay, what do you know about the offspring? Question B. So in this cross, what, if anything, do we know about the genotypes or the genetics of individual 4? It's either going to have Absolutely. It'll either have a CA3 or a CA6. It has to inherit one or the other of those chromosomes from that parent. Okay. So let's assume in this example that that was actually the CA6 allele. So question C. What, if any, conclusion could we draw about the genotype of individual 3
Either both of them are CA6, CA6.
if that individual's genotype is that?
Either
What-
one or both.
Okay, so individual 3 then has to have,
No. That's it, they have to have both CA6s, right? For number 3.
so does individual 3 have to have just one CA6, or does it have to have both alleles being CA6?
Because the other one can only contribute either a 6 or a 3, and it's obviously contributing the 6 in that case.
Yep,
So, I mean, I guess it could have some other one.
right, so that chromosome, in this particular individual 4, all we need to know is that there was at least one CA6 in both parents. It's just that in this case, this chromosome here didn't get used in this fertilization event that produced individual 4. So you get the genotype of an individual, you know that the parents had to have one of each of the alleles. So this genotype, this CA6 had to be in one of the parents, the other chromosome had to come from the other parent. We won't worry about D right now. It's another question we could ask. So if you change the known genotype of individual 4, what does that tell us about the parent genotypes? Actually, we probably should talk about this. So what if this individual's genotype, instead of CA6, CA6 is CA7, CA5?
Translocation or like insertion or something.
So mutation. So we're not looking at Mendelian inheritance of this from the previous generation. We're looking at new alleles. What else could that mean?
Chimera.
So what if this individual was CA5, CA7? Is that possible?
How come there was nothing that came from the other
Maybe they
positive?
didn't separate or something.
Right, so now we're drawing from last class and this class. Could it be chimerism? Could it be parthenogenesis? So could parthenogenesis of this individual, if their genotype is CA5, CA7, produce an offspring whose genotype is CA5, CA7? It works genetically. So the mom's genotype, in this case, if this individual 3 was a female, then mom's genotype would be identical to her offspring. So I mentioned last class this idea that there had been a hammerhead shark, it was, I didn't mention that last class, that had been captured as a juvenile and brought into an aquarium. And then there was a shark in the tank. What I didn't mention is that there were 3 female sharks in the tank. And the zookeepers came in the morning and there was a baby shark, shark number 4. And so the zookeepers took tissue from all of the sharks, the 3 adults, CM1, CM3, and CM2 were their names. And then they also took DNA from the pup. So there are 4 individuals here, and they looked at 4 genes. We can call them gene 1, gene 2, gene 3, and gene 4. But they're numbered exactly the same way as in that previous example. So at gene 1, for example, each number represents a different allele. So this individual is homozygous for 124, that one's heterozygous, and so forth. Who was the parent of this pup?
CM2.
So we've got 3 adults, CM1, CM3, and CM2.
Two.
Could it be CM1?
The first gene matches.
So there's something about the bold, yes. Focus on the bold letters, or bold numbers. What about gene 2? So everybody, so I know some of you have already gotten the answer. Look at gene 2, 181, 189. Could that individual be the parent of a pup whose genotype is 187 over 187? No, because on the previous slide we said that if you know this individual has a 187, its parent had to also. That's how it got inherited. Okay, so the only parent that has alleles that could have been, that are matched the offspring, the pup, is CM2. And that's how they identified, they went back and they looked at the records of this shark, CM2, and that was when they discovered that this shark had been never exposed to a male before. And that's how they decided that this must have been parthenogenesis. It's had to be, of the 3 sharks that could have been this pup's mother, it had to be CM2 because of the genotypes. So this is another way to find out whether or not an organism is asexually or sexually reproducing. You can look at the genotypes of parents and the genotypes of the kids, and there will be certain patterns in parthenogenesis where the only genetic match of an offspring is to one mother, not to any of the males in the population. That would be another way to diagnose parthenogenesis, virgin birth. So to motivate us and to propel us into the next class, this is related to real patterns in nature. It's a cartoon. But this is a real representation of how many species in nature are sexually reproducing versus asexually reproducing. So as we move into next Monday and talking about the benefits and the costs of sex, what does it seem like is more beneficial? Sexual reproduction or asexual? Sexual, right. Because we see most species are sexual. And what happens when there's an asexual, the last point? I know you're urging to get the hell out of here. When you see that thick red branch, which means asexuality, what never happens to those taxa? They never separate. There's never speciation events. It's like asexuality is an evolutionary dead end. As soon as you evolve asexuality, your lineage goes extinct. You don't speciate, and make a huge portion of the phylogenetic tree be asexual. You get one origin, and then at some point your lineage goes extinct. So next class we talk about pros and cons. If you are part of one of the RAP groups, please email me immediately if somebody can go to the Tuesday meeting.